In this video, we'll cover bean scopes. Scope refers to the life cycle of a bean, such as how long does the bean live, how many instances are created, and how is the bean shared. Now, the default scope in Spring is singleton. Okay, so the default scope is singleton. Very important. What is a singleton? Well, Spring Container creates only one instance of the bean by default, and it's cached in memory, and all dependency injections for that bean will reference the same bean. All right, so it's just a singleton, one single item that's created in memory and shared amongst different other items. Here's an example of this. So I have this demo controller. I have two references here, my coach, another coach. I'll inject it using qualifier cricket coach, the coach, another qualifier cricket coach, the another coach, and they both point to the same instance because by default, Spring beans are singleton beans. There's only one instance that's created. Now, we could also explicitly specify the bean scope. So in our class cricket coach, we could make use of scope annotation, and then we give configurable bean factory dot scope singleton. There's additional Spring bean scopes. We already saw the first one here for the singleton scope. There's also prototype scope. It'll create a new bean instance for each container request or for each injection point. There's a request scope that's scoped to an HTTP web request, only used for web apps. There's also a session scope that's scoped to an HTTP web session, again, only used for web apps. And then there's a global session that's scoped to the global HTTP web session in the case of web apps. Now, let's take a look at a prototype scope example. Now, with prototype scope, a new object instance is created for each injection. So we have to specify the scope on the actual class here, the bean. So Cricket Coach, we have scope, configurable bean factory dot scope prototype. Create a new one for each instance. Let's look at a prototype scope example, a new object instance for each injection. We have our demo controller, we have our two fields here, and then we reference our Cricket Coach, the coach, Cricket Coach, the another coach. Since this is a prototype scope bean, you'll get a new object instance for each injection. So they point to two different areas of memory or two different beans. How could we check on the scope? Well, we could write some code here as far as a get mapping for /check. And I'll return the results here. So I'll say comparing beans, my coach equals another coach. And then I put the actual expression here. So this will check to see if this is the same bean. This will return true or false depending on the bean scope. For singleton scope, it'll return true because remember singleton is shared and it points to the same bean. If it's prototype scope, it'll return false because with prototype, you get a new instance for each one of them and they won't point to the same item. All right, so this is really good. Let's go ahead and dive into our IDE and let's write the code for this and check out scopes.